There I am. So we've got a strong panel of speakers today. So I'll just introduce the colleagues who are going to contribute. We've got Emily Morrison, who's head of the Institute of Community Studies. Fiona Goodwin from EAUC, the Alliance for Sustainability, Leadership and Education. Duncan Ross, Chief Data Officer from Times Higher Education, and Julie Tam, Deputy Director for Policy, Universities UK. What I'm going to do is kick off straight away by inviting Emily to speak, but just before that, in terms of housekeeping arrangements, we will have a series of speakers making relatively brief contributions, 10 to 15 minutes each. And then we'll have a panel session at which we'll invite questions and put questions to our panel of speakers. The event is being recorded, and we would hope to be able to use this recording, putting it up on the website, so it'll be available for people to look at after the event of the meeting. But with no further ado, can I hand over to Emily and ask her to introduce her report. Emily.
Thanks very much, Des, and good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to speak to you today. So I'm going to be presenting a very short section of the report, which is a much longer report that based on a series of expert roundtables with sustainability and civic leads across members of the Civic University Network, which took place in the first half of this year. The focus of those roundtables was really to bring together universities that were experiencing commonplace challenges if we think about climate action and a transition to net zero. So rather than perhaps grouping universities because of geographic proximity or grouping them because of the kind of type of university institution that they represented, so Russell Group or so forth, we wanted to put place at the centre of this programme. And so we looked at, for example, grouping all universities that were based in coastal locations, which have particular challenges around climate impacts, particular types of economy often. We looked at the northern powerhouse kind of group and those that are re-industrial, post-industrial universities based in towns and cities. We looked at a London and Southeast group, obviously looking at the particular challenges around the capital. And we also looked at groups based in more rural locations that perhaps didn't have as much kind of competition and diversity in terms of city relationships there. And that proved to be a very fruitful way of organising sort of HEIs to think about climate action, because what we found was that there were common definitions around how universities were approaching transition to net zero and working with their local places because of the kind of characteristics and the conditions, whether that was to do with deprivation or whether that was to do with assets and opportunities that place had. And if I can just go to my first slide, what I'd like to sort of zoom in on today is really focus on one of the key challenges which came out of that report, which was about governance and measurement of climate action. And so why focus on governance? Well, particularly because at the moment it's incredibly disparate and there isn't much of a shared approach that we found from place to place. We're at the moment at the Institute for Community Studies, funded by the Nuffield Foundation, to look at community and place transition towards net zero across the UK. And we're working in a number of different places and neighbourhoods. And one of the things that we found during the systematic evidence review of that piece was that particularly the role of higher education institutions in the climate action agenda should include, amongst a number of other opportunities that they should take part in, it should include supporting agency and inclusive governance. And the evidence was very clear that HEIs have a role as anchor institutions in doing that. And what we found then when we started to talk to member universities about how governance was organised around net zero transition and climate action in place was that they were being led by a number of different alignments. The majority looked at the EAUC scorecard, but there was a lot of alignment to measuring and organising goals around the SDGs, so the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, as well as trying to adhere to often disparate but powerful local measures, such as thinking about the numbers of green jobs and sector growth that was happening locally, trying to align to other economic measures, that the council or local authority or city and regional authority had put in place, thinking about right down to air pollution and more advanced instruments that perhaps certain departments in the university could measure. So it was very diverse, very disparate, but also a huge area of potential opportunity in terms of how we think about how we show what progress looks like, both by the university as an institution, but also in terms of as we start to track whether places are moving towards being net zero or carbon neutral or carbon negative, according to how the goals have been defined for that place. What you can see on the screen there is a domain of place, so a framework that was started to put together out of those roundtables, but also paying attention to the evidence coming out of the Nuffield report, which started to break down really the kind of complexity of the different domains of place that will be affected by net zero transition in the UK, and then started to think about the role of the university in affecting this, and then how governance could be structured around it. And really what you can see from the framework shows is the real challenge of measuring activity that can be incredibly small scale, community or voluntary sector led, or led even by individual academic, student, staff teams, and right up to you're needing to measure the contribution of very large scale infrastructural projects, large scale economic, transport change, housing adaptation. And then they've also revealed a real challenge with managing to measure contribution of the university to certain local goals versus attribution, where maybe the university was taking a more direct role in, for example, carbon capture or reducing carbon footprinting. And then, of course, a lot of you will on the call will know that there are different local areas are working to different time windows, which don't always align to the national strategies around net zero. So some city regions working to 2030, some councils to 2035, 2040, 2050, and the list goes on. And all of this represents, I suppose, a bit of a challenge and a question in terms of how we govern and measure progress towards net zero. So if I could just move to the next slide, please. So a couple of considerations that emerged from that research in terms of measurement, and this may seem quite obvious, but it really came across in terms of how difficult it was to perhaps put a one-size-fits-all approach into measuring progress by HEIs towards climate action. And one of those was that a lot of different higher education institutions working with their local areas were defining the challenge of becoming greener or of a sustainable future very differently. So for some, it was very much primarily an economic challenge. It was about the transition of economies, the growth of, say, green job sectors, and decarbonising the economy. For others, it was more of a social challenge that looked at, how to move places that had long-standing issues of deprivation and, being left behind to being a very different type of place and community. Environmental obviously came to the fore, particularly in terms of how we think about campuses, particularly how we think about the actual activities taking part within a university, whether that's research, teaching, student engagement or student pathway activity, and how that can be greener and carbon neutral. But then there were other framings that really emerged in terms of how people were tracking progress, focused on place-centered innovation. So thinking about what could be done differently through this agenda that had not been able to be done before, and how do you measure the impact of innovation? And then particularly from our Scottish partners, a just transition really came to the fore, and also to a degree with some of the Welsh partners, thinking about this being an agenda for justice and an agenda that should ideally result in a more equitable place or a more equitable society at the end of the challenge. So I suppose this is just being presented to illustrate some of the complexities of how people are thinking about this and how we're organising governance around it. But there were some commonalities. So the majority of mature strategies by HEIs included goals for putting it blunt, championing the environment and the role of staff and student participation, decarbonising the economy, which was typically in partnership with other businesses and anchor institutions, and a strong focus on meeting net zero scope 1, 2 and 3. Biodiversity on and off campus, so a lot of focus on how to measure the growth of biodiversity and the reinvigoration depending on the place context. Quite a few included goals around ethical education and public engagement, but very few included goals around HEI to HEI collaborative working, or between HEIs and FE. And that was an area which a lot of institutions on the call really thought that they could see a stronger role in the future. If I could just move to the next slide, please. And finally, what this has started to reveal, if we look across the ways that different places working with higher education institutions have started to focus on their governance, or the experience of governance at the moment, is there's 4 kind of common approaches that are developing, which I just wanted to share with you, perhaps as food for thought for the rest of the panel. So the first is a university-led approach, fairly straightforward in terms of doing what it says on the tin, which is there's a strong core of sustainability leadership, applied use of the scorecard, lots of measurement of campus and institutional level activities, supply chains, and depending then on the institution, additional capture of how the university community has a carbon footprint, and that included people measuring, for example, amounts of overseas research travel, where the students themselves were coming from. And often this university-led approach was accompanied by student organising and university research groups, which were also focused on green transition. So that was one of the most common approaches that we found to governance. Affiliate anchor was very much more of an inside-outside relationship. So thinking about the relationship between town and gown, as it's often called, where the university was part of a city level or local government led working group on net zero transition and climate action that was often inspired by either the council or the local authority declaring a climate emergency. And in those cases, the local authority often held the roadmap. Possibly there was a climate commissioner, depending on the level of commitment to net zero transition and the level of resource. But we did often find that universities reported that their role, the expectations from the local area, were not often well defined. And they thought that there could be room for better definition of the contribution there. Fund devolved. Now, this is an interesting one where, particularly for certain places, including where councils hadn't declared a climate emergency, but where it was a priority for the university, it was found that the action around climate and net zero transition was often distributed and resourced across a number of different funds. And this is something that I think, given the really challenging funding landscape and potential sort of recession and reinvigoration of austerity that we may see over the next year, is something to really watch out for. So we found that in some cases, rather than having a kind of clear centralized governance, the work across, sort of towards net zero or to address climate action was distributed across research and development funding, infrastructural funding, potentially a devolution deal in certain places, and potentially the shared prosperity fund and other community level funds, where coordination, rather than maybe having a central governance, was limited to individual partnerships. The final one that was particularly prevalent in industrial and post-industrial areas was the business innovation-led approach. And this was where the challenge was very much conceptualized as one of innovation or adaptation of place, so adaptation to climate impacts, and where local action was led primarily from a large investor or a business working group, or the largest local employer, so places that, for example, had an airport but weren't necessarily a very large secondary city. And there we found that particularly the goals and the sense of tracking progress was focused on hard infrastructural or economic change, with the university typically positioned as the source of research and development, or where they could attract, further innovation funding and future investment. So that was a more limited number of cases, but there was a strong sense that in some places, actually, the corporate sector was taking a real leadership of the challenge, and indeed, providing a significant amount of the resource. So that's just giving you a bit of food for thought. We're continuing this work and really thrilled to continue engagement with members of the Civic University Network about this, but I'll hand back over to Des and the panel to take forward the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Emily. And I would certainly recommend to people that they have a look at the report, which is, I think, available on the Civic University's website. So can we move now to Fiona and get her thoughts on the work that EAUC has been doing on their scorecard and reporting framework? Fiona.
Thanks, Des, and hello everyone, and great to be here. So I just wanted to sort of cover a couple of things that EAUC are leading on. So we are developing a standardized carbon emissions reporting framework which is being funded by the Department for Education. And this is part of their sustainability and climate change strategy that they launched earlier this year in April. So that's basically developing, as I say, a standardized way of reporting. So this is real guidance for institutions on how to apply the greenhouse gas protocol to their own university or college. And this is really trying to bring that sort of comparison, so you know what level institutions are reporting at, what they're reporting, and really giving guidance. So whilst we're developing the framework, it's the methodology guidance, which is the real sort of meat on the bone, so to speak, in terms of what actually providing that guidance in terms of, one, how do you report, but also what do you report, and what's the good practice in terms of that, in terms of sharing. And I think that's a real key thing here within this group, is how can we learn from each other, and what Des was saying, good and bad practice, you know, what does work and what doesn't work. So I think that's a really key element. And I think, you know, as Emily said about the place-based aspects, and, you know, don't do this on your own. All of your other institutions that are around you, such as colleges, but also schools, because this will start trickling down to schools as well. And there's also a real civic role that universities can do to really help support other institutions. And this could be for the wider public sector, not just for the education sector, but in terms of you have the experts within your institution, you have the academics, the researchers, the scientists. So you could be going and supporting colleges and schools, and, as I say, other public sectors in terms of how they're addressing their net zero journey. And I think, but also you can really learn from those as well. As Emily said, you know, a lot of institutions will be part of their local authority or local council, or maybe a city level in terms of net zero. So you need to work with your other anchor institutions in your area. And I think that's really, you know, that can be part of your net zero journey as well. So, for example, if you look at transport, for example, your local authority might be bringing in more buses, for example, which then you can influence and make sure that you have regular buses to your campus. And then that can be part of your net zero journey, but you're working with the local authority, so you're not duplicating. You know, you don't want to be sitting there scratching your head going, how on earth am I going to do this, when there might actually already be a solution that's happening either at a city, you know, regional level. So I think that's a real key thing. The carbon emissions framework will be out in January. So we'll be delivering that to the department in December, and then they will then be working out how to cross-check that with the actual data collection aspect of it, and that'll still be in discussion with the department for that. But I think also in terms of the role, and I'm going to go into UN speak here, so I apologise. But you know, in terms of the UN, they call us institutions, but also other public sector bodies, but also companies, as non-state actors. And this is where you have a real role, again, sort of a civic role in terms of the responsibility that you have. So, you know, that's all the financial institutions, all the companies, all the universities, colleges, schools, hospitals, police, fire, etc., etc. You all have a role and a responsibility to contribute to the overarching country's nationally determined contributions in terms of how does the UK get to its net zero target of 2050. And everyone has a role within that to play. But I think it's also really important not to just think of the carbon. It's not just the carbon. And I think the role of institutions that they have, you know, what is actually at the heart of every university is the education, the curriculum. What do you teach the young people, all the people that are coming through your institution? And also, you know, in terms of what is your role within that wider net zero strategy. So for example, you know, again, using a transport analogy, I'm focused on transport for some reason today. But you know, the electric vehicles that are coming in by 2030. How do we ensure the engineers of today know how to operate an electric vehicle in terms of designing, you know, but also actually servicing? Only 1% of mechanics at the moment can actually service an electric vehicle. So there's a huge upskilling, retraining, what other kind of words that you want to use that's like that. But, you know, that's a whole huge responsibility for an institution. So we can't carry on teaching how we used to teach. We need to teach the right skills and the right things. So young people coming through today have the skills to operate, to work within a changing climate. We're not just talking about engineers here, but it's architects, it's lawyers, it's doctors, it's nurses. Everyone has to have these skills in order to do that. And I think that's a really crucial thing. And I just think also, if I can just talk a little bit about, and I know Duncan's going to talk about the international side of things, but there is a huge international responsibility as well here. Many institutions have very high international students, you know, so how do you match that up with quite an aggressive international student recruitment program, for example, annual carbon, when you're asking your students to fly across the world to come and study at your institution? But also, I think a lot of institutions have partners with other universities in different countries. And often many universities actually have overseas campuses. And I think there is a real civic role where you can be also supporting those partners, those overseas campuses, in terms of sharing your knowledge, but also hearing how they're doing, because depending on where they are, if they're more in the global south, they're probably already very much facing the changing climate in terms of flooding, droughts. You know, we've seen all of this on the news. And I think that's a really crucial part, is they're already having to do that adaptation. We can actually learn a lot from those in order to make sure our institutions are future fit. And I think that's going again back to the anchors in our communities section, in terms of, you know, a lot of universities have been here for several hundreds of years. We need to make sure you're still here in several hundreds of years. And that means that you have to take action in order to make sure your buildings are future fit. You know, can you adapt your buildings to make sure that they're not flooding, you know, dealing with extreme heat, extreme cold, etc. And I think just going back to the Sustainability Leadership Scorecard, which is something that we, EAUC, deliver along with AUD, which is the Association of Universities Directors of Estates. And this is a really holistic view of your institution. And this doesn't just cover carbon, this covers partnerships, engagement, human resources, biodiversity, and everything else. But what is unique about the scorecard is that in every single, there's 14 frameworks that cover all aspects of sustainability. In every single framework, the curriculum is part of that. So it's no good doing things in isolation, no good doing things in silos. So you might have a great biodiversity action plan, but how are you engaging your students? How are you engaging your staff, but also the wider community as well? And I think the biodiversity angle is a really interesting part for universities in particular, because a lot of universities have a lot of land, which is often publicly accessible. And therefore, you're providing green spaces, you're providing clean air, health and well-being, you know, to not just your staff and your students, but to the wider community as well. And I think that's where, again, working with your community in terms of that and the role that you have there. So I think that there's a real opportunity, and I think this is where it can often go down with carbon and talking about net zero, but there is a real role that universities have, and Emily mentioned sort of the just transition in terms of that, and it's making sure that you know, you're part of that just transition. We're partnering with a project up in Scotland, which is an offsetting project but it's actually reusing the fossil fuel infrastructure. But then we are part of the project is to retrain and upskill those people that work in the fossil fuel industry to work in a carbon capture industry. So it's making sure that those communities do have that opportunity to reskill, to move away from fossil fuels and still have a career and a community that's around that. So it's just repurposing it. And I think that's sort of a really key place as well. So I think the Sustainability Leadership Scorecard is also linked to the Sustainable Development Goals. So every framework is mapped to the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think in terms of sort of that civic responsibility for an institution, that if you implement the SDGs across your institution, but not just in your operations, but in your teaching, in your curriculum, also your research. How do you map your research to those goals? We work in partnership with UKRI for a lot of our activities, and that is a real key issue for them in terms of they are looking at the research that they fund, which essentially is their scope 3 emissions. So how can they influence the research in this? And how do we get that research out to the wider public, to our own institutions? How can the sector actually help itself by listening and learning from its own research and the scientific advice? And at the end of the day, it's our scientists that in our universities that are at COP27 right now in Egypt, telling everyone what we need to do. But do we as institutions, as universities, need to listen to our own scientists for doing that? And hopefully with the tools that we have at EAUC for the carbon emissions framework, but also the Sustainability Leadership Scorecard. And I know Emily mentioned offsetting, so I'm going to plug that as well, because we have an offsetting initiative called the Carbon Coalition. And if anyone knows anything about carbon offsetting, there are a lot of ethics involved in that. And basically, we have got, again, academic scientists that really lead in this area to really help us give that advice, so you as institutions don't have to go through all those potholes and navigate your way through all of this. We provide a good ethical option for offsetting, and we're really pushing and leading in different areas in offsetting. So UNFCCC are developing a new sovereign carbon credit. So this is countries that are actually controlling the offsetting projects that happen in their countries. And this has been led by Papua New Guinea, Malaysia, Indonesia, where they're actually taking control, because almost if you're offsetting in another country, you're basically taking that country's ability to get to net zero themselves. So it's almost a colonialism approach to offsetting. So we've got to really have that civic responsibility, and again, really listen to our scientists and our academics. But I think the key point is that you've all got to work together as an institution and look at all of the different areas and not just focus on the carbon element. It has to be in the wider picture of it. And I think something that I'm pushing the Department for Education on, which is another element of their sustainability and climate strategy, is about nature parks, and they're wanting to develop almost a biodiversity nature corridor. At the moment it's just schools, but I'd be pushing them to include universities and colleges in that, and then together as a sector we can have a real impact and grow and build those nature corridors between all of our institutions. But also there's a real learning and teaching element in here. In basically, wouldn't it be great if our university students could go to the schools, go to those colleges, and then those young people can see that there's careers and opportunities in this space in terms of doing a job that can really influence them, and have sort of the green jobs and the green skills agenda really influencing sort of what kind of careers and jobs that we need to have in our changing climate. So I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to hearing from the rest of the panel.
That's great. Thanks very much, Fiona. Lots of interesting and challenging information there. Can we maybe carry on with that interesting and challenging process and the SDG aspect by now moving on to hear from Duncan from Times Higher Education?
Thank you very much, Des. So my name is Duncan Ross. I'm the Chief Data Officer for Times Higher Education. And since 2019, we have been creating a university ranking that we call the Impact Ranking that looks explicitly at how universities across the world are participating in delivering the Sustainable Development Goals. And we chose the goals for a framework because of some of the issues that Emily and Fiona have already mentioned. The fact that as well as focusing in on net zero and things like focusing on species risk under SDGs 14 and 15, it also reminds us that actually if we're to deliver a sustainable future, we need to have climate justice as well. We need to ensure that both within countries and across countries, there is far more equality than we see at the moment. And so we decided to do this ranking around the SDGs because we believe that universities have a critical role to play in the delivery. I believe they are key, and a new phrase I learned today, non-state actors in terms of that delivery. Now, why is that the case? Well, firstly, there is simply the fact that universities are found pretty much wherever there are people. This makes them very different than other industries. If you look at finance, for example, you can talk to 90% of the world's finance by going to a handful of cities around the world: Frankfurt, New York, used to be London, Paris, and so on. But with universities, universities are wherever there are people. They are engaged in civic society everywhere. The second reason is that the university sector, the higher education sector, is about 1.7% of gross world product. It's a big part of the global economy. And that has really critical strength and weight when we think about some of our university towns. So I live in the East Midlands. My nearest university town is Loughborough. The University of Loughborough is the biggest single employer in that. Well, possibly the NHS might just eclipse it, but it's one of the biggest employers in Loughborough. The role that universities can play in their civic context is something that we need to bear in mind. But the other thing that is something that's really come to me rather lately, and it was actually inspired by one of the speakers at our Global Sustainable Development Congress up in Glasgow, is the fact that universities, uniquely amongst institutions, take the long view. Unlike companies which tend to focus on the next 3 months' profits, unlike our governments and politicians who tend to focus on the next election, universities have traditionally looked at the next 40, 50, 100 years. And that's something that's critically important when we think about climate change, because the problems we face are not the problems of the next 2 to 3 years, although those will be critical, but it's about the next century and how we put things in place to make sure that the world is livable and habitable beyond our relatively short-term focuses. But of course, in measuring or trying to measure around the SDGs, there are a number of critical challenges. The first one is fairly basic. The SDGs were not written with universities in mind. So they have lots of fantastic targets, but some of them may seem to be out of the reach of universities. So for example, target 3.A talks about implementation of the World Health Organization Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which is something that's really important, but probably outside the scope of any one university to achieve. So we had to work out a way of going from these targets to a set of measurements which might make sense in the higher education context. And so to help us do that, we built out a theory of change which has 4 key elements. And I think all of these 4 elements talk to this idea of universities in the civic context. So the first aspect we look at is research. And you may say, well, research isn't necessarily rooted in the civic context. But what Fiona talked about already, this idea of partnership, is critically part of that. It is how universities work together. Yes, within the UK, but also critically how universities in the UK partner with universities in lower and middle income countries so that you can share from each other's experiences. And that's certainly not about UK universities telling universities in lower middle income countries, this is what good practice looks like. It's very much a two-way process of learning from people who, let's face facts, you know, we're sitting here in the UK and we are in a relatively well-off position in terms of we've done our climate exploitation, we've seen the benefits of that. But the people who are going to be affected by climate change first are typically in those lower and middle income countries. So learning from how the universities are looking at research in the local context is critically important. So research is the first part of that theory of change. The second, again, Fiona mentioned this very clearly, teaching. The idea of ensuring that we have people with the right skills, the green skills needed for each of the SDGs, but also making sure that sustainability is embedded in our curricula, that actually everyone who leaves a university, whatever role they go on to in life, takes with them what it means to be a sustainable citizen for the future. So that aspect of teaching is the second part of our theory of change. And obviously that needs to reflect local needs. You need to make sure you have people with the right skills for your particular context. The third element is what we call stewardship, and stewardship is both how you look after your immediate surroundings, your buildings, the lands that your university owns, the rivers and seas next to your university. But it's also about being a good employer and working well with all of the people who work in and around universities. And again, universities often have much larger footprints than we think. We think of universities, and particularly academics often think of universities in terms of the faculty. And then you expand it, maybe say, well, okay, grudgingly we'll accept that there are students as well. But actually the university is far more than that. It is everyone who works in and around the university, all the people you need to make sure that the university functions, and all of their families and the people that they interact with on a daily basis. That broader community is something that the university has responsibility for. And then the final aspect of our theory of change is outreach. And this is built on the fundamental assumption that universities are not separate from their communities, that they work in and around their communities. However they want to define that community, it can be a very broad definition, it can be a very precise definition. But often this work hasn't been fully recognized, certainly not in rankings. And so finding ways to measure and identify the outreach work that universities do is critically important. So that's the framework we put together, and from that we built a series of metrics that relate to the targets of the SDGs, but also through that lens. And we built out this ranking, and really we hope that it gives a way of universities across the world, that international context, of starting to understand some of the ways that they are contributing towards delivering the SDGs. Now, obviously, it's not perfect. No measurement system is. There are things that we measure that we would love to measure more accurately in more detail. And that's where I put a challenge out to people on this call. In your own context, you will be able to assess and identify measures which are much more relevant to your university than any measure I can put together. I have to create measures that work for over 1,500 universities from across the world. You can have very precise measures, and we do see evidence of this in the rankings. For example, and I'll name check here, Charles Sturt University in Australia have done a lot of work around carbon offsetting. They use carbon offsetting, but what they haven't stood still and said, okay, we're using carbon offsetting, that's great. What they've then done is they have applied their own research techniques to explore those carbon offsets and to grade the offsets they're buying themselves, so that they can identify which ones they really believe are having a positive impact and which ones they believe are less effective, so they can focus future carbon offsetting on the ones that are effective, not the ones that are ineffective. So that kind of deeper measurement is something that I would strongly recommend universities consider. Now, again, a couple of other things about our approach. Firstly, we believe that wherever possible, this information should be in the public domain. So when we ask universities to supply particularly narratives about what they're doing, we give them extra credit when the thing they're describing is publicly visible. Okay, because it's that idea of saying you should share what you're doing. Also, to be honest, it gives us greater confidence, and you're holding yourself accountable to your towns, to your cities, to your stakeholders. But what we're also seeing, which I think is really positive, is that universities in different parts of the world have very different focuses. Now, how can we tell this? Well, when we designed the ranking, we designed a possibly overly complex methodology, but essentially the idea was that we would have one linchpin sustainable development goal, SDG 17, Partnership for the Goals, but then universities are free to submit to any SDGs they like. And when we explore which SDGs universities are submitting to, we see very different patterns in different parts of the world. Universities in the UK, for example, often focus on SDG 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities, SDG 12, Responsible Consumption and Production, and SDG 16, Peace, Justice and Strong Institutions. But if we looked at India, we would see universities looking at SDG 1, No Poverty, SDG 6, Clean Water and Sanitation, and so on. So we see this very clearly on an international scale, that actually universities are pretty good at recognizing the things that are important to them in their contexts. And again, we heard some of that from Emily's report earlier, this idea that universities need to reflect their immediate needs, their civic needs where they are. If you're a university in London, you will have very different concerns than if you are a university that is in, say, Hull or Sunderland. So this is something we do see. We do see universities being reflective around that. And the final thing I'll say is just to touch on the degree to which universities link into this idea of civic responsibility and civic interconnectedness. Obviously, SDG 17 talks of partnerships for the goals, but SDG 16, Peace, Justice and Strong Institution, recognizes the need for us to support our politicians and our decision makers by providing great research that actually informs the policy debate. Now, of course, we can't guarantee that politicians will listen to what we're saying, but there is some sign of hope from the United States. Who knows? Maybe in the UK in some point in the future, but the idea of actually providing that useful insight to our politicians so that they can make better decisions is key. Obviously, SDG 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities, talks directly to this, but also I would say SDG 8. So this idea of universities as being economic drivers in our communities, and how universities shape that agenda by choosing how to focus their work on developing their local economies, will also be key in the future. With that, I'll stop there and hand back to Des.
Thanks very much, Duncan. Lots of interesting issues there, and challenging issues, I think, for universities. I mean, we all want to do stuff in this space. The question is, how can we do it effectively, and how can we do it well and in partnership with other people? Which, in a sense, is, I suppose, what we're going to ask Julie to say something about from the Universities UK perspective. So over to you, Julie.
Thank you very much, Des. That's a very nice segue into my talk. I'm just going to attempt to share my slides. Let's see how hopefully you can see that. And I'll just move to full screen. Okay, well, thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute to today's discussion. It's really great to see all of the work that the Civic University Network has done on climate action. And I really enjoyed Emily's report. It had a lot of fascinating insights. And what I'm going to speak about today is to reflect on the work that we have done at Universities UK and to compare what we have found with the findings of Emily's report, and end with some reflections on measurement and governance. So over the past 2 years, UUK has made climate a real key part of the work that we do with our members. We wanted to use the UK hosting COP26 as a real opportunity to highlight the importance of sustainability and climate action, and to really support our members in their efforts to act locally, to set targets, and deepen their teaching and research roles to really make a difference. We held discussions back in early 2021. We wanted to engage all 140 of our members, and we wanted to get a better sense of where our members were at with their sustainability journeys, what they perceived the barriers were to further change, and how we as UK could help. And our conversations culminated in a publication prior to COP26 of what our members were committing to around supporting the government's plans to achieve net zero by 2050, or at the latest, for devolved government equivalents. And they were also committing to be more visible about reporting progress against their emissions targets. And they were also committing to use the Climate Commission's Climate Action Toolkit to develop further actions. And we were part of the Climate Commission, along with EAUC, and Fiona and I were very involved with that. When we had our conversations with our members, they were really passionate about the, I suppose, multidimensional role that universities play in addressing the climate and ecological emergency. They mentioned their roles in education, their roles in research and innovation, national and global leadership, and leading by example with their campuses. But what really stood out for me in the conversations was how many spoke strongly about how they felt that their university had a real responsibility to contribute locally, and collaborating with local stakeholders to achieve ambitions, to advance local initiatives, and to support green growth at the local level. However, many challenges were also cited by our members, and what we discussed and what we had main points that arose in the discussions really resonated strongly with what's presented in Emily's report, particularly in the table around local transition challenges and the challenges that vary by type of place. And we heard often that net zero is perceived to be at times a competitive rather than a collaborative challenge, and how many wanted to do more at the local level and collaborate more at the local level, but that the strategic coordination to achieve this, either within a university or in their local place, was just not there yet to do more collaboration. And we also heard that there was not always public and community recognition of what universities do locally. And that takes me on to some of the work that we've done on public engagement. So in 2021, we ran a phase of our Made at Uni campaign on climate action. And our campaign aimed to showcase to the public the bold and impactful ways that universities are leading the way in tackling the climate emergency. And we really wanted this campaign to have a strong local impact element. And we collected a number of case studies from our members as material for the campaign. Now, the case studies we collected covered a number of local elements, themes that I've listed on the slide here, such as engaging communities with climate issues, co-creating sustainable solutions, creating green jobs, and protecting local environments. And I've put again on the slide some of the examples and impacts that were cited. Now, it's interesting to note that in looking through the kind of raw material that we collected for our campaign, I was having a look at the case studies that had a local theme, and around 60% of these case studies that had a local theme cited a partner, which again goes back to what other panelists have said. I mean, having a partner may indicate an underlying factor to achieve success and impact of the initiative. And like in Emily's report, there was a wide range of partnerships cited, including local government, private industry, and the types of arrangements. There were either joint arrangements, privately funded partnerships. And again, looking at the case studies that were submitted as material for our campaign, around 70% of the local initiatives in the case studies mentioned a local impact, but a further 14% mentioned a national or a global impact that grew from an initial local impact. And I think this really demonstrates the power of local initiatives to have wider impacts. But how aware is the public and community of the impact of their local university? And as part of our Made at Uni campaign, we commissioned research on public opinion, and we focused on attitudes of parents, children aged between 16 and 18. Now, why did we focus on this group? Because this group is a key demographic that we wanted to target, because they're a key group that influences the thinking of political parties, and they are significant consumers of media coverage on universities. Now, our survey showed that around 1/5 of parents in the survey believe universities have no effect on tackling climate change, and 57% believe they only have a slight impact. Now, that's quite disappointing, and you can see from the chart in terms of the size of the blue bar that universities were the least thought about group when it comes to having a large impact on tackling climate change. But what do parents think about when they do associate universities with climate change? So we asked, what specifically do you associate with universities? And you can see from the top chart that around 1/3 mentioned educating local schools and communities about climate change, and a lower proportion, around 27%, mentioned actually working towards solutions, working with local schools and communities to tackle climate change. So that's what parents currently associate universities with. But what would parents like to see? So we asked parents, and you can see from the bottom chart what they'd like to see. And you can see that the second top priority was actually working with local schools and communities to tackle climate change in terms of working on solutions. And fourth top, 57%, mentioned that they'd like to see more of educating local schools and communities. So you can see that there's clearly a need for universities to be more vocal about all of the work that we do, as well as addressing the barriers to doing more. So how do we do more, and how do we do it better? So we do need to navigate the difficulties involved in competing priorities for resource, including funding. And at the current time, for all of us really, and as well as for universities, a top consideration is the cost of living crisis, the cost of energy, the impact on students, staff, rising cost of energy for the university. But even before the cost of living crisis, a major challenge that was cited by our members was being hit by competing demands, falls in the real income received per domestic student due to a fixed fee cap. Fiona mentioned the pressure of, in relation to international students, and there's obviously pressure there to recruit more international students in terms of income received. And there was challenges cited around just being able to devote sufficient resource to local sustainability initiatives. And the difficulties that some universities have in justifying resources needed is mentioned in Emily's report. We also need to improve internal and local coordination. And what we hear from our members, again, resonates with what's mentioned in Emily's report around how activity can be in silos, the lack of joined up strategies between local authorities, universities, and other civic institutions. And we also need to give some thought to how we can improve support to staff at all levels within an institution on how to navigate these challenges. And this is a real priority for us at Universities UK. How do we support university leaders, their senior teams, States directors, sustainability leads to all push together for change? So how can better measurement and governance help? Well, the better we can measure progress or the success of past actions, the greater the chance we have of securing funding in what is a really challenging environment. So there's much more work that we need to do to really help articulate the benefits of universities working with local stakeholders. We need to be better at measuring progress and demonstrating progress, both to the public, but also internally to make strong business cases. Perhaps one thing we need to give more thought to is how do we calculate the cost of not acting and coordinating now, because the cost of achieving net zero is only going to grow. good governance definitely matters. And again, I agree with Emily's report when it says that there's a need for strengthened models of governance between Anchor and other institutions. Now, university chairs can play a really critical role here in drawing together the connections between how a university operates and how it's connected locally. And the Committee of University Chairs, along with partners in the Climate Commission, produced a guide in 2021 to help university chairs fulfill their role with implementable actions. Now, the risks of not meeting net zero or being misaligned to local sustainability plans and actions is really significant, both financially and reputationally. So these are risks that really must be front and centre of governing boards' minds. So I think I'll leave it there, Des, and looking forward to questions and a discussion with the rest of the panel. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Julie. I think we've had really interesting contributions from all our speakers. So thank you very much to all of you for that. While I'm waiting for some questions to come in on the question and answer, I just wanted to kick off by kind of homing back on this idea of self-assessment. Universities are moving towards self-assessment of what they're achieving in this space, and that's helping them undoubtedly to clarify their objectives and progress. I'm just wondering how the methods and tools being used for that purpose, and you know, we've had indications of how that's been developed by Duncan and Fiona in particular, how those tools might be used to assess the role of anchor institutions in contributing to what places can be achieved here. You know, in a sense, we're part of a wider movement. Climate change doesn't stop at the boundaries of the university. So how can these measurements and measurement methods, you know, be used to kind of see what the contribution of universities is and should be in that context? Can maybe start with Duncan, and then I'll come to Fiona.
Of course. So there is an established mechanism for a self-assessment, the voluntary review. And the voluntary review is something that some cities have undertaken. So New York City, for example, undertook a voluntary review. And part of that would be looking at all the institutions within the city bounds. So it is entirely plausible and possible for that to be done within existing mechanisms. I'm only aware of one university that's undertaken its own voluntary review, and from memory that's Carnegie Mellon, but I may have got that one wrong, but it is a US institution that's done that. Interestingly, the person who led that review was the person who had led the review in New York City. So she had the experience to do that. Now, that, of course, is quite a challenging thing to do because it requires you to effectively start from ground zero and build up both the measures and the assessment of the measures. I think as a starting point, there's nothing wrong with looking at existing mechanisms that are out there, look at the work that EAUC are doing, absolutely look at the methodology that Times Higher Education has pulled together, and look through those for the metrics that make sense for you. Because sometimes you will say, well, you know, this particular measure that Duncan's asking me to do, it's not relevant to us in our context. So absolutely pick and choose, find the measures that make sense to you, but also try and go further, try and understand what is it that is specific to our institution, or where can we go much further. And there are things out there that can support you. If you're interested in curriculum, for example, then the work that is being done by Sully Test on the engagement of curriculum for sustainability is worth looking at. If you're interested in greenhouse gas protocols, particularly scope 3, then the work that the CANI network is doing around student transport links and how to optimize those is again worth looking at. So there are a variety of sources out there. But one thing I would like to touch on, which I think is critical and is also very, very difficult to measure, is that aspect of governance. And how do we ensure that we have university governance that is focused on this as an issue, and that sustainability doesn't end up being relegated to 2 people down the road in the facility that we're going to close in 3 years' time? But you know, that has often been the situation in the past. What I hope is that through things like the survey that Julie showed us, through the work that Emily is doing, that we can elevate sustainability to being one of the key things that our university leadership focus on. And I think that's what we need to do. But of course, measuring what makes for great governance is a very, very difficult thing, because if we knew what made for great governance, then we'd have great governance all around the place. And we see in so many cases, not necessarily in the university sector, I'll not blame universities, but we see how challenging it is to have effective, good governance.
Great, thanks, Duncan. Fiona, did you want to come in on this question?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I think, just picking up sort of Duncan's point there, I think this is where it's critical that this has to be at the very heart of the institution's strategy and their values. And this isn't just a nice thing to do, as Duncan says, this has got to be throughout. And students are more demanding of this. They want to see action. They can see through any greenwashing. So if you're going to claiming wild things, they will call you to account. And students are increasingly looking at sustainability actions in terms of choosing which institution they want to go to. So in terms of the actual business case of a university, that's student numbers. If you want to attract more students, you've got to do this, because that's increasingly in that. And therefore, if it's within your strategy, within your values, then that is going to be part of your governance structure, and really engage with your governors on this. And as Duncan says, it can't just be 1 or 2 people that run this. This has got to be whole institution approach, and very much on the sustainability leadership scorecard. This really enables you to engage different people. There's many different approaches you can do on how you approach the scorecard, but and there's plenty of case studies about that. But you can actually go, right, you're responsible for this one particular framework. You know, you own it, you control it, you do the self-assessment. And I think what's really key with the self-assessment as well is it recognizes what you're already doing and where you need to do more action. So it's a real gap analysis tool. So, and I think, you know, universities often are a bit siloed and you won't necessarily know what is happening across the institution. So this is a real good opportunity to get that snapshot of what is actually happening on the ground today. And therefore that then gives you a real gap analysis and go, right, we're not doing anything on this topic. You know, so we need to really sort of build on that. And then that's your action plan, and you know, and then that gets you. But you need to engage more people within the institution and really embed it as a whole institution approach. And I think, you know, as Duncan says, you've got to make it your own. So there's complete flexibility within the scorecard. We've got a default mapping, if you like, for the SDGs against each of the frameworks. But if you're, for example, a city centre institution, you might have a real sort of poverty issue, which will be more relevant to you than if you're in perhaps a more affluent city or town, that wouldn't be such an issue. So you can really mold it to your own institution, and then that really makes it much more relevant for you.
Thanks very much, Fiona. Just you're picking up on what both of you have said. I think, you know, Duncan and Fiona, in a sense, you're really advocating a very kind of flexible benchmarking system. You know, one which, in a sense, the universities themselves define what they're trying to achieve and then measure against it. But there's always a tendency, I think, for people to want to see things in hard numbers. So, can you measure the carbon impact of this? I guess what I'd like to ask Emily and Julie is really whether they think that trying to measure process is possible, and you know, based on what they've heard from Duncan and Fiona, what they see as the kind of great advantages of the approach that's been adopted, and are there any disadvantages? Maybe start with Emily.
Thanks, Des. And I've been really fascinated listening to the discussion. I think measuring process is possible. I think you have to be very clear on the contribution versus attribution points that you know, I outlined in the presentation, but also to maybe try and break process down into the key most measurable bits, if that makes sense. And some of those, you know, you would probably expect me to say, but for example, I think, as several people, including Julia, have so astutely said, you know, working towards this agenda requires a much more diverse long-term range of partnerships. So being able to think about how does this agenda grow, diversify your partnerships, the duration, the strength of those, you know, even, you know, sort of how inclusive or distributed they are across the local area, or then indeed, you know, are you twinning with other institutions nationally, internationally across this agenda? You know, there's a lot that can be done in terms of measuring partnerships and then qualitatively measuring the experience and outcomes of partnerships. So what does that enable you from a capacity perspective to do? Building on capacity, I think there's a lot that can be measured in terms of personal development and professional development, you know, in terms of staff, but also students. This agenda aligns really closely to the service learning agenda. And I think, you know, thinking about how can we build in rather than create separate metrics for how this agenda, you know, sort of develops our students, you know, attributes and personal skills and their professional skills, and having an ear to industry and to employers in terms of what they're also looking for. So it becomes also part of just supporting them into good work. I think that is, or into green jobs of the future. There's a huge amount of opportunity for integration there. And then the last thing I think is around community engagement and community power. And then that also comes to the need in this agenda, if you're going to make net zero really work for place, to think about what are the assets and the social infrastructure and the resources that need to be built and cultivated locally, and how can you measure the university's contribution to building community assets, to you know, building structures for involvement of community leaders and community representatives. That is all eminently measurable. You need both qualitative, quantitative approaches to do it well, but I think it's about breaking it down into those stages. The only final thing that I would say is that I find it's really, really fascinating because, as Duncan says so brilliantly, you know, this is an international agenda as well as a national, as well as a regional and local. And in a sense, it's just for the sector, I think, and obviously I sit outside of the sector in the community and voluntary sector, to have one ear to the fact that at national government level, but also in local government, certain metrics are inclusive already, or becoming more inclusive of some of these green metrics. So, for example, the push towards social value measurement, that is very, very aligned, very synonymous, not perfect, but very aligned, synonymous to aspects of how we might measure progress towards being a greener society. So just a sort of I suppose, an ear to the ground to think about where do you need to add in additional forms of measurement, and where is there actually good, more mainstream forms of measurement that are already, you know, becoming more popular, that can do it for you. So just a sort of ear to the ground on that as well. Des, thanks.
Thanks very much. I mean, I was at the THE conference last week in Glasgow, and what was interesting was the range of people from all around the world interested in this agenda, and the very interestingly different things that people were doing. So there is a sense in which we can teach and learn, I think, from colleagues in other places. Julie, come to you on the process question.
I mean, I think measurement of processes, it's so difficult to do, because you're measuring the sort of the strength of human relationships and the strength of relationships. And I think, you know, what sometimes isn't in simple metrics is the kind of the richness of relationships and networks. And so we almost need to be better at telling the story behind the metrics as well. So I'm just thinking about sort of the parallel here with sort of evaluation approaches. So almost if you could take the evaluation kind of approach of specific initiatives and talk to people like we do in evaluations when we do sort of like thinking about their parental survey again, when we talk to people's perceptions about how things have changed, culture shifts, culture change, that could be measured in a metric in terms of people's perceptions. But I think the important thing as well is to kind of measure progress over time in terms of culture shift. But again, that kind of qualitative element is extremely important, as well as the kind of quant element. And sort of going back to the previous question, thinking about sort of measurement, and what really I've sort of been thinking about is how do you measure the impact of a university's local contribution? How do you measure something like convening power? How do you measure something like the power of a discussion where a key person from a university was there and was really influential in helping the local kind of community or local authority make a decision? How do you capture that in a metric? How do you capture that in terms of outputs, outcomes, and in a sort of broad sort of framework? So I don't think there are sort of any easy answers, but I think it's definitely something that, that we need to get better at. I'm encouraged though that just formerly HESA are going to be doing a review of their HEPC survey in terms of the metrics, looking at business and community interaction. So again, maybe there's a source there that we could really tap into to build into Duncan's measures and to build into the scorecard that would just really look at how a university really works with the community and interacts and what the impacts might be. So, but yeah, definitely something we need to get better at.
Great, thanks very much, Julie. Going back again to Fiona and Duncan, amongst the key themes of Emily's report are firstly the need to tell communities what the story is and what can be done, and secondly the need to include community voices, the voices of beneficiaries, in deliberations about what should be done in this space. Is this something it's possible to include in the tools and benchmarking structures that you're proposing, and how can that be effectively done? Duncan, do you want to go first?
Yeah, but just before I answer that, I think there's one other way, Julie, that we can think about the future of measurement, which is perhaps grander than all of this. The SDGs themselves were created in 2015. They are targets for 2030. Now, it's only 7 years until 2030. Well, 7 years and 1 and a bit months, which means that realistically, we know that there's going to be another set of targets and goals that will be created by the United Nations for that next period. And they're going to have to start on that work soon. I think there's a real case that the higher education sector needs to get itself into that process to help ensure that the targets and measures that the UN sets out are as good as they can be. I think that would be a brilliant thing for the higher education sector to do. We talk about ourselves as conveners, we talk about ourselves as doing research. Can we provide that really critical input to direct the next generation of goals, because those will be really, really important. So that was my slight aside. And Emily, sorry, that social value measurement should absolutely be part of that context. But Des, back to your actual question, which was around this idea of, well, what can we do to measure the interrelationship between higher education institutions and communities? Well, we already have some measures in there that try to do that, but it is a difficult thing to do. So, for example, under SDG 16, we ask whether or not members of the wider community have an active place within universities' leadership and management structures. And it's interesting to see the answer to that, and to one of the questions in the Q&A around student involvement. Again, that's another question we have. To what degree do universities actually support students to participate effectively in leadership structures? And throughout all of the SDGs, one of the things we look at in terms of the outreach is that idea of what work are you doing with the community? And there's an expectation, I guess we could be more explicit about that, but there is an expectation that isn't a sort of university going out and saying this is the way the world is to ignorant members of the community, that actually it should be a two-way process. It should be about the university taking their skills and experience, but also learning from people in the community. If you're looking at SDG 2, for example, Zero Hunger, absolutely we should be learning from, amongst others, Indigenous peoples, farmers, the communities who are directly affected by hunger, rather than assuming that we can come in with our privilege, our relatively comfortable existences. It's hard to imagine someone coming from the senior common room after a nice glass of port and talking to people about hunger. We need to actually learn from people in the communities, as well as taking our message out to the communities.
Thanks very much, Fiona.
Yeah, I think the key thing is communication. I don't think universities are particularly very good at communicating about all of the things that they do, but I absolutely, completely agree with Duncan. It's got to be a two-way process. And this is working with your staff, your students, and the wider community. And going back to my earlier point about sort of working with your local council or city, you know, a lot of people already have climate commissions set up or climate committees set up, and universities should definitely have a place on that table, but also listen to all of the other non-state actors within your region of what they're doing, and talking to your employees, and talking to, you know, the SMEs that you purchase from. You know, how can you influence them? You know, the wider influence sphere that a university has, whilst individually it might not be a particularly big number, but collectively as a whole sector, it's massive. And then I think, you know, we've got a real opportunity to not only support other education institutions, but also, you know, help other SMEs, the wider public sector. But I think just also from the previous discussion, don't just get bogged down with the process and measuring. It's all about action. Yes, you have to measure. Yes, you have to report. You have to be transparent. And you don't know how you're progressing if you're not measuring. So yes, you have to measure. But don't get down a rabbit hole in terms of how accurate is that data. You know, what can we do better? Do we have to spend 2 months in a dark room looking at data? You know, it's, yes, get your best data that you possibly can, but then it's all about the action that you need to do. And so I think that's a crucial thing. And I think also that there are, you know, opportunities to disseminate and learn from other institutions, such as the impact rankings, such as the Green Gown Awards, which we run in the UK and Ireland, but also internationally. You know, the whole ethos of the awards is all about dissemination, and it's all about a critical part of the judging process is how replicable is this? How can this be done in other universities and colleges across the world, but also in the UK? We announced our winners last week at our award ceremony, and there's a wealth of information on our website about all of those, not just the winners, but the finalists as well, because they've all got something to learn from. And again, warts and all, in terms of what didn't work, what were the challenges, what were those barriers that you had to get over. So I think communicate what you're doing, but also share what you're doing with the wider sector as well. But also do engage. You need that engagement with your staff, with your students, and the students will come up with brilliant ideas, as well as the community. You know, it's got to work for everyone.
Thanks, Fiona. One of the issues that strikes me as interesting here is the issue of leadership. So, you know, universities typically have as their core missions, their research mission, their teaching mission, and everything else, you know, comes into a kind of loose bag that you might call the third mission that can be picked up or neglected, you know, depending on circumstances. But the core missions are teaching and research. Is there, in a sense, an onus on vice chancellors and principals to, in a sense, look at how they exercise leadership in this space? I mean, I'm minded to think of the conference of mayors that got set up around COP, where mayors got together to decide how they could take forward at a city level, you know, their actions on climate. I mean, is there an argument for, in a sense, vice chancellors to get together and make some kind of a statement or commitment, which in their case, I mean, I would hope would be balanced by evidence, you know, would actually require, you know, a more systematic approach than perhaps others might venture to do, but would actually, you know, make this climate mission a kind of more central part than perhaps it is just at the minute. It's maybe a question for Julie in the first instance, but I'm going to bring Emily after that.
I knew that question was coming my way, Des. No, absolutely. I mean, it's really interesting that climate was a really core topic at our members' annual conference back in September. We had a session, a brilliant session, and so many of our members are really committed to doing more on climate. And I think that's why we were really keen prior to COP26 to have some sort of commitment, some sort of statement. I think the challenge is it's not just about warm words, it's about action. And what we've been working really hard with our members is actually how do you turn commitments into visible change at your institution. So that's our priority sort of for the year ahead. And I think one thing that we're just finding is that there's no sort of shortage of sort of commitment that vice chancellors want to do more and in terms of their leadership of their institutions. It's just juggling those competing priorities, as I mentioned. It's just, being hit with so many different requirements in England from the Office for Students, and just making sure that your staff are all empowered to make that change as well. And I'm really sort of always quite fascinated by one of our members who said that they are really committed as a vice chancellor to doing more. They had someone on their sort of senior board, sort of a PVC for research. They had a really dedicated estates director and a dedicated sustainability lead, but still change was still not as rapid as they would have liked. And I think we get a lot of calls at UK for sort of more support and affecting change within an institution. And it's how do we navigate some of those barriers, because people are working at capacity, being thrown lots of different sort of challenges every day. How do we make climate an absolute priority that doesn't get derailed by the latest with what's happening in the kind of political environment, or threats to funding that might happen as a result of the fiscal event that's coming this week? It's how do we really help vice chancellors on a day-to-day basis sort of maintain enough resource and capacity to make a change? So again, I think that's something that is a real priority for us to help support our members, and just because we don't want it just to be about warm words, we want to see visible change.
That's great. Emily.
Thanks, Des. And I mean, I couldn't agree more with what Julie's just said. I think I would say absolutely yes. And I think the challenge with leadership is that because there is such a capacity constraint in terms of at the top of universities, I think what we need to think about, and what's increasingly evident now, is we need structures and forums for leadership that go through multiple levels of the university. And this is a really energizing agenda for students. It's an energizing agenda for a lot of alumni. It's an energizing agenda for community leaders locally and members of the public. And so I think our focus on leadership needs to actually be that there are currently, there's some very good, but arguably quite kind of siloed spaces where there's, opportunities for people to build their leadership skills, build their capacity. I see someone's asked about how do you unite radical, sort of student-led agendas with the more managerialist approach? Well, I think the answer here is having leadership structures that feel more democratic, distributed and shared. There are a few universities who are doing it really, really well, actually thinking about sustainability from the university's perspective being led not just from one lead or from the senior management group, but actually we've got student leads in different departments. We've got then partnerships into the local leadership in the community. So then you get a much more distributed, less hierarchical kind of version of leadership. And actually what that really results in, if we're thinking about action, is more hands on deck, and more hands with more time on deck, and more alignment of resources and strengths and skills and knowledge. And so I think that's where I see, alongside the absolutely essential work with vice chancellors, and then also with local government leaders who are similarly cash strapped and time poor, I think what we need to think is a much more distributed version of leadership around this agenda. And I think that can only be to the good of a lot of other agendas in the university that also need that distributed agenda. So whether that's in the form of green champions, but I'm talking about something much more, I think, potentially exciting, progressive and long-term, ideally, in terms of a leadership program that goes right down through all the layers of the university.
Thanks, Emily. One of the things that Glasgow's been doing, which I think is really interesting, is thinking about micro-credentials. So looking at how people can have, short courses which are available not just the existing student body, but are potentially available to people who have left university or maybe not got to university, but want to pick up a particular set of skills or knowledge that are available in universities. Is something like that a mechanism for breaking down, you know, some of the barriers that people have to acquiring this knowledge or getting engaged? Could we think about different types of credentials as ways of opening up this agenda? I'm just.
I can come in there. So we EAUC deliver carbon literacy training, and I think this is often one of the issues in terms of leadership, is that the leadership team may not know or have the expertise or the skills to actually lead in this area. So there's a real upskilling in terms of the leadership team, and we're just about to announce release some senior leadership carbon literacy training specifically aimed at the senior leaders. But I think that's also true for all staff as well, you know, in this area, and in terms of that. And I think, you know, there's lots of modules and micro credentials, and, you know, Duncan's already mentioned the silly test, you know, so there's lots of different things aimed at students, and a lot of universities do include sustainability as a induction module, for example, when they first start. But the problem is it can't just be a module right at the start of the university and then they never hear anything ever again about it. So it has to be fully embedded within.
Yeah, I think just to come in on that, I think that micro credentials are particularly useful for alumni and the broader community, where you can actually give people something that is recognized that will also help them move forward. But I think, and again, this is kind of looking at one of the questions in Q&A, which talks about University of Barcelona, which is now making a mandatory course or mandatory aspects of education around this. And we can kind of think of this in almost a hierarchy. At the bottom, you have kind of voluntary courses. And why are they at the bottom of the hierarchy? Well, actually, at the bottom, you have nothing. But above that, you have voluntary courses such as micro credentials. They're useful, but they're voluntary and they only get you so far. Above that, you have mandatory courses. Fiona just mentioned the idea of an introductory course at the beginning of the university. But what the gold standard has to be is the incorporation of sustainability into the core curriculum, because what it means, what sustainability means within an engineering course may be very different from what sustainability means in a humanities course. There are specific things that people will need to learn that relate to their course, and it should be in the context of that course that we bring sustainability into play. So that's something to bear in mind, that idea of actually embedding sustainability throughout our curricula to make it something that is expected and something that is part of the way that we think in our professional careers going forward.
Thanks very much. I'm afraid we've just about run out of time, so apologies if there's points that people wanted to raise beyond what they've put forward. But I think we've actually had some great presentations and a fascinating discussion from our panel members. So I'd like to thank all of them for that, and we'll have the information from this event on the website soon, and there are some further events that are now up on the screen that people may well be interested in. So can I thank all the panelists, thank the audience for tuning in, and I hope you have an enjoyable rest of the day. Thank you.